Hello, guys. Welcome back to Curiosity for the another discussion on Indian football, and particularly our focus today will be also the Asian football because there are some big developments happening in the Asian football. And today we have with a special guest, Mr. Martin Lowe, sir, who is regularly writing for the Asian game and someone who is following for Asian football for quite some long time. So welcome to the channel, sir.
No, thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to a good discussion.
The first question, sir, is today regarding the two big news is coming up for the Asian football. First is Karim Benzema to Saudi Arabia after Ronaldo. Another big star footballer is coming into the Asian football. Second news is regarding the Saudi Arabia's approval of the privatization, and there is news coming up that 20 billion has been they are planning to, you can say, inject for this 2030 vision. So how do you see this Saudi Arabia's role in the Asian football development, and does the next decade is going to be the center point for the Asian football, and does the you can say the world football is shifting from European football to Asian football? What's your view regarding all this Saudi Arabia's big investment in the football?
Yeah, it's interesting news, isn't it, really? And I think we've been waiting for this for quite some time. Probably kind of this time last year in terms of there's a lot more focus, a lot more organisation around the backroom of how the structures are working in Saudi Arabian football, from kind of youth football through to assembling the league. The Saudi Pro League is now a lot more organised, a lot more professional in its kind of status. And obviously the signing of Ronaldo probably came ahead of time. They probably weren't expecting it to come that quick, but obviously it dovetailed at a nice point. Ronaldo was leaving United and needed that kind of jump in. This summer was the intended kind of release of it. How that release comes out, and we're expecting it this week in terms of the dominoes are going to start to fall. We've heard the first kind of signals of that from Mohammed bin Salman's announcement this morning around privatising the clubs. Look at the investment that he wants to put in, and he wants to be seeing Saudi Pro League to be one of the top 10 within the world. The level of players is something we haven't seen in Asia before. The likes of Benzema, Modric, Kante. The players are getting listed off, and obviously the big one, the golden jewel, is Messi, and whether that can be a kind of an enticement of it. So this is slightly on a different scale to what it was in China, for example, where we've seen this before, where there's been a hell of a lot of money thrown at the game. And probably the jump from that wasn't kind of seen beneficial for the rest of Asia or even for China, because it was very short-term kind of logistical side of things. And China was based on political kind of direction, trying to kind of increase kind of participation in sports, the eyes of the world that way. And it's very similar towards Saudi Arabia, but there's probably more money or more money in the short term to kind of be spent from Saudi Arabia's side of things. But it's looking at a soft power kind of edge, but also internally to appeal to kind of next generation of Saudi Arabians who are a lot more worldwide wise in terms of social media, having a lot more of an impact. The government's kind of idea is that Saudi Arabia is a modern facing country, not necessarily a Western country. There is a lot of Islamic kind of focus. It's the heart of Arab nations. So it's going to do it in a slightly different way, but that is through something that's very popular medium in terms of football. I think there's some things that haven't been played out too much on Western media at the moment in terms of the differences between Saudi Arabia and China, is that obviously the integral nature of them in the Islamic world. Obviously, Benzema being a Muslim, the same with Kante, it's going to have an appeal to a different side to footballers that we haven't seen before. It's not going to be a case of just going to kind of money-wise. It's obviously a lesser standard than Spain or England's football. But the quality of the footballing heritage, the culture is not fully known yet in the Western side of things, but you were already seeing that from sound bites from Ronaldo, which I think are surprising in terms of it's undoubtedly one of the main reasons why he went out there was to get some extra money. But he is surprised at the level of quality. It's not up to the standard as what we expect at the moment, but the standard of the atmosphere, the culture that's there, is definitely going to surprise a lot of fans.
Exactly, as you rightly mentioned, because there are some people who have doubt that the plan that China has implemented and the money China has implemented has not worked as they planned for. So some people have doubt that might be the Saudi Arabia's plan also might, you can say, but the way they are planning and the way they are approaching, I think is looking more and more promising that they will, you can say, achieve the 2030 goal. And what is the reaction in the European footballing world that this Saudi Arabia's whole plan of this injection this much of money, and how do you they say, particularly Premier League, La Liga, or how they are seeing this whole thing?
Very similar to how it was in China, I suppose, in that it disrupts the transfer market massively in the initial part. So we'll have these kind of discussions about players going, not necessarily these players that are out on the way out in retirement, but also players that will start to come into their peak, will start to look towards Saudi Arabia. We had that with China, with Oscar, with Marouane Fellaini heading over to China in the peak of their careers rather than at the end of it. And we'll see that increase again. And I don't think there'll be much difference in that kind of initial turnover for the next year. It'll just be that kind of annoyance on the side in terms of inflating transfer fees, inflating wages. There's always going to be that competition. But I still think, from at least from a short-term perspective, that European gaze won't kind of look over here. There won't be English fans watching Saudi Pro League alongside Serie A and La Liga. The only time that's going to kind of have an impact is when there is a direct correlation to one another. And I think it's interesting at the time that this expansion is happening. The Club World Cup is expected to have an expansion in 2025. Generally, across the Western views and European views, is that it's a B-rate competition. It's an end of season thing. It doesn't really mean anything as such. But the expansion means that you're not on your own. You're not, when you're going over there as Real Madrid, you've got Man City next to you, you've got Inter Milan, so you've got some competition. And then that will start to have a bit of credibility if all of a sudden Al Nassr, Al Hilal are starting to compete against you. And I think that's where it could potentially shift. And it's the next stage is kind of the value of kind of Saudi Arabian players and so on. They are at that standard to move to Europe. There probably isn't incentives to do that now. But it'll be interesting to kind of see how they're perceived on a kind of longer term basis as well.
But the one thing is, sir, that as you rightly said, that currently they are targeting players who are closer to retirement, or you can say plus 30 of age. But when they are going for the big talents like of age where the 25 or younger talents, then I think the reaction, or you can say FIFA, or you can say the financial fair play rules, I think they are going, European particularly bodies are going to try to implement. What's your thought about it? Is they are going to, you can say, you can crunch on that thing, that financial play has to be, you can say, implement on, because these are the outrageous, you can say, 150 100 million offers are outrageous. So how they are, when they are going to basically going to react, when the younger players are going to be targeted?
There isn't an argument that the younger players have already been targeted. Obviously, Brazilians, South Americans that have come over to England and to La Liga don't come on big salaries straight away. There is a kind of an element of risk in there, and once they've got on board, then they become the big names that they want to be. Saudi Arabia and other Asian nations are already in that pipeline and able to bring players over directly to Saudi Arabia that Western viewers wouldn't have heard of. So Romarinho, Anderson Talisca, a couple of great kind of examples of players that are capable of being in top European leagues, but nobody's heard of them because they've never been over to that. So the argument is that it's already happening at the moment. The second part of your question in terms of financial fair play is obviously it's a European kind of conception, a European conception that's obviously got a lot of criticism in terms of it keeps the elite as they are, in terms of the bigger teams stay big, the small teams aren't able to kind of make that jump up. And we'll see kind of obviously quite a correlation is going to be Newcastle United and how the Saudi money kind of flows through that perspective. But financial fair play isn't a thing in Asia, so there isn't going to be those kind of regulation in place. And we saw that with China, that the AFC didn't really want to get involved in that kind of area of sport. It increases the perception of Asian football, even through an individual nation. So unless we kind of see a long-term picture where we see a distortion and an impact on Asian football, I don't think they're going to step in and have this kind of moral compass to kind of move on that. The only thing will be internal regulation, and that's what we saw from China in the last kind of embers of kind of spending the money. There was an internal moral compass of saying we're spending too much money here. It's not public appetite for it. We'll have limits on transfer fees, etc. But that was from the Chinese government rather than a footballing power such as FIFA or the AFC.
The other thing we have to mention here is the Qatar, because if Saudi is going in that direction, that means Qatar is also, you can say, higher up standard. So how is the Qatar direction regarding this, and what are their planning? Because they are also targeting Manchester United, and what's they are planning for their league also.
I suppose it's a two-pronged side of things. So there's obviously the ownership side of things in terms of the Man United bid, which I think is very similar along the same lines as Man City was in terms of PSG, etc. This is a kind of a global soft power kind of way of legitimizing kind of Middle Eastern wealth in European football as such. In terms of investment into the domestic game, we've seen that kind of over the last 20 years in terms of bringing over kind of established stars and seeing how that works. I don't think it's had the kind of desired impact that Qataris would want in that. The Qatar Star Leagues is dropping, I would say, in standards. I think the standard of it is considerably behind Saudi Arabia when 5 years ago it was contesting with them. And there is a rebuild job on that. There's discussions within the QSL that maybe we should be looking at youth rather than established players. And I was going back to your previous mention in terms of appealing to younger players to come to Qatar who are unheralded on small amounts of money to develop them under the facilities that they've got, rather than going for established names like Ronaldo, Messi. I think that boat's missed at the moment. Obviously, there'll be a reaction to the Saudi deal if all of a sudden Saudi Arabia becomes this massive footballing league that everybody wants to tune into over the next 5 years, then I'm sure they'll have a part in that. But I think because they've gone through that kind of process at the moment, I think there will be that focus about trying to buy teams in kind of Europe to have that kind of stage. But in terms of the local league at the moment, I think it's redeveloping in a very different guise, on a very local guise, rather than this international perspective that Saudi are going on.
Other thing we are, you can say, seeing in the Asian football is regarding the naturalization of citizenship, because many countries are now allowing the naturalization process to have the, you can say, quality players of Africa, or you can say Latin America. So how do you see that impact the Asian football and the quality? Because Indonesia and these are all are the countries are started to allowing the naturalization process.
It's one of two things, isn't it, really? And it kind of spells to what worth do you put on kind of international football? Because obviously international football is an emotional kind of tie in terms of it's the best from your country, leading your country to kind of success into Asian Cup, World Cup, etc. Where that kind of murkies is that you can buy in and nationalize players, and some of it's kind of there's different layers of that kind of nationalization, from kind of young players that have come over very young in their career, spent their whole career in that particular country, or those players that have just come over very quickly and they're able to kind of twist quite quickly, or heritage through kind of parentage, etc. And we've seen that with Australia, with the amount of kind of new imports in terms of Jason Cummings, for example, who's obviously kind of rumoured to go into India quite soon, is somebody that had never kind of set foot in Australia prior to his call up. So there are different kind of layers, and that will depend on your kind of personal basis on that. Whether it's a positive or a negative for Asian football, I think the quality of football improves from that in terms of the better players that we have in Asian Cup qualification is going to help things. And I think it starts to actually appeal to kind of youngsters in terms of, if I can be at that standard. For example, Indonesia, as you mentioned, this is returning back to Asian Cup. Would they have made the Asian Cup without those nationalised players? This is a question to be asked. So there's a lot of a myriad of questions, because I know that at the opposite end of the spectrum is Malaysia, where they've had a lot more kind of ins and outs of kind of quality of players. You've seen the appetite not being there for some of them. So it's definitely kind of an individual personal take. My personal take is that we're in a global society with migration happening as it is. I think international football becomes less and less of a kind of an issue in terms of an established kind of thing. But I'm speaking as a Westerner in a very kind of multicultural country. That might not be the case for everybody.
The other thing, if we compare the Asian football with, you can say, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and the other side is South Korea and Japan. The South Korean teams currently are into the semi-final of FIFA Under-20 World Cup. So the two countries are, you can say, investing on their youth proper structurized wise, and two countries who are heavily invested on the foreign players and dependent on them. How do you see this? Both are successful, because Japan and South Korea, we recently see, although in the FIFA World Cup, so what they have capable of. So how do you see this two, you can say, opposite side of way to, you can say, improve the football in the Asian, you can say, continent?
It's a long-term vision, and I think that's the key thing for it. And I know obviously India have got their own kind of long-term vision. Saudi Arabia is this vision of 2030, where Japan have put obviously the 100-year plan is being the kind of the staple that everybody really wants to aspire to. When they put that out, it was kind of a laughing stock to imagine that they would be in kind of a contention for a World Cup. And I don't think it's entirely unforeseeable that they could potentially win a World Cup in the next 50 years. I think they've made those strides already to say that their improvement is there. And that's investment in leagues, investment in youth structures, and being patient with it, not expecting these things to kind of come on straight away. And there's a number of kind of concerns about kind of what the transfer activity is from Japan through to Europe. There's not a lot of transfer fees, but that helps Japanese talents to get into Europe and play at a higher standard. And there's not that kind of, I suppose, toxic club atmosphere in terms of allowing your star players to go to Europe. You're wanting them to go on and succeed. And I think that's where Korea and Japan have benefited from, obviously, from that 2002 World Cup, where they were exposed in that kind of light in terms of how to kind of make the next step was to get young talent out into Europe. And there's a lot of great players that didn't make it in Europe, but they went out there, they made those grounds. And they're the reason why we now have Son Heung-min, we now have Mitoma making a kind of an impact. It takes time over that. And I think that's always been the difficulty from a West Asian perspective in terms of especially the United Arab Emirates, when they were starting to come through with their golden age with Omar Abdulrahman, Ahmed Khalil, Ali Mabkout. These players were kind of at that standard where they should have been playing in Europe, but there wasn't that opportunity to go in at the level that they were expecting. So both on a salary expectation and being a starter at a team that in a top 5 league, they would have had to gone very low salaries, built their way up, and probably not made the kind of the top standing, but they would have broken that ground for Emirati talent. And the same would go for Qatari talent in terms of you've got to kind of bed your health in there and don't have that kind of easy way out of going, oh, I'll go home and be the star at home as I've always been. And I think now that the money's come in from Saudi Arabia, and I don't think in the next 5-10 years we're going to see that kind of expansion. It would be nice to see some of these young players going out to Europe and testing themselves. But I think it's a slightly different culture in terms you've got that comfort at home. There's less comfort in Japan, Korea in terms of monetary side of things. There is a push to kind of push them that way, and that's where the national team will work. I think the opposite will be the case for West Asian players.
The other confederation which is making impact is the ASEAN, particularly Vietnam. If we talk about, they are a very good plan, and in this last 10 years they make very good progress. So ASEAN countries, recently we seen SEA Games where also the crowd and everything is I think amazing, and the quality of matches are also amazing. So how do you see the ASEAN countries are making and investing heavily on the football, and they also want to make the impact on the, you can say, game?
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of how the strides that they've made in general as a region, and individually. I think you've seen kind of from structures in place in terms of from Vietnam's perspective, they put a lot of work into the kind of youth initially, and having a kind of clear philosophy from kind of underage groups right up to the senior team. They play a single way as a team, and kind of how that works as such. I think you've seen the opposite for kind of Thailand, who have looked to kind of get their players out into kind of having cooperation with Japan and kind of getting players out into different nations. And I think there's a combination of how it works with you individually, and it would perspective of what the domestic output is, what is the kind of appetite from fans in your country, what's the monetary situation, what kind of incentives can you put in there to get these players kind of exceeding their kind of levels. And I think there's a number of layers that are doing that, from national team, youth development, but also from the club sides, in that kind of expectation for players to go out. And I think you hit a kind of brick wall in terms of that club involvement, which you potentially get in kind of Japan and Korea, which Gwen Kang Hai, who was at in Vietnam with Hanoi, took him 2-3 years longer than he needed to get out and go and play in Europe, because that club side were not going to be, they were going to say, well, what's in it for us for losing our best player? And I think that's where you start to kind of need to get that unified kind of embrace of, this is where we're going to, and this is how we're going to get there. But obviously they've kind of got off the ground the SEA Games in terms of the Suzuki Cup and now the Mitsubishi Electric Cup. Is they've got that appetite and that kind of franchise internally as well. I think we shouldn't be lost on kind of improving our internal side of things and being happy with that. In terms of the products on the Mitsubishi Electric Cup, is a very enticing tournament for anybody to be watching. It shouldn't be a case of it's the World Cup, it's the Champions League, and that's it. There's got to be a consideration of how do we get there, enjoy the ride as much as the destination.
The one region is a SAF region, who is you can say the lowest region, which is may make the impact on the, you can say, Asian football, but the fan base wise is the biggest. I think the potential and the fan base wise, SAF region is very, you can say, much bigger than compared to other you can say federation. But how do you see the SAF region and their impact in future? Because currently there one issue regarding Pakistan is also going on, that their government is not allowing into the SAF championship. Sri Lanka is already banned for FIFA. India also get banned and got out. So SAF countries regularly, you can say, are under the, you can say, FIFA's watch, and regularly they are not, you can say, ready for that. So how do you see SAF region and their impact might be in the Asian football?
Well, as you say, it's been a problematic kind of recent periods in terms of the political infighting and how that's kind of worked out. And I think that's kind of spelt out onto the pitch, and we haven't seen that kind of progress, especially in Indian football. Obviously, there are the difficulty, the positives and the negatives are that India is such a dominant force within SAF, and it's difficult to have a yardstick when you've got kind of, you're looking either side of East and West and trying to make your formula as your own kind of approach. And I think India are in that difficult situation. There's nobody comparable in terms of size of country, appetite for the football, the fact that you've got other sports that are contesting with you at the same time, that appetite of kind of cash that's kind of come in, which is at a significant level, but obviously not at the same levels as maybe the West is. So I think it's geography very difficult as well in terms of that side of things. It's one of those, and I've spoken to a number of people from kind of Indian football in terms of where do we go from here? Is this kind of silver bullet side of things? Shall we copy this? Shall we copy that? Shall we copy it? And it's finding your identity. And I think the vision, obviously, a lot of these visions are commendable on paper, but it's following through on that. And I think there's a short-termism in a lot of developing nations because they want to get to that level. It's going to take time. You're not going to get there as a kind of off the top of it. My kind of thing is, again, getting players out of India and getting them to kind of taste football. As we mentioned before about kind of getting players out to fail. And India have got two by example in terms of Gurpreet Singh and Sandesh Jhingan, who have gone out to Europe in all respects, I suppose, failed in their kind of getting it consistent minutes, etc., and then have come back. Don't leave it there. Don't see it as a failure. The next generation, the Anirudh Thapa, Udanta Singh, get them out into the kind of and start to kind of get this as a kind of a consistent side of things. Get Western European viewers understanding that Indian football is a thing, and that is one kind of way of getting forward. The other is to accept and embrace Asian football and try and how that kind of works through the AFC competitions, which we might discuss a bit more in terms of trying to get a foothold in that and trying to move your way forward at that side of things. But it is a difficult thing of kind of taking the best best bits from some areas, like the Japan 100-year plan, but also getting players into those areas, but also embracing those around you and trying to kind of make that work as well.
But the as you rightly mentioned, and I also believe same, that Indian players should go to the, you can say, European league in second or third division wherever they get chance. But the main problem is the ISL's salary, because the salary which Indian players gets from the ISL is much more higher than, you can say, English championships also. So that is the hurdle, that player don't want to, you can say, go out from their comfort level. They want to stay in India. So that's the biggest hurdle. And Harshit Sudhbhai is asking that where does you rate ISL in top Asian leagues, and also should India join CAF or WAF? I don't think so. CAF or WAF is possible for India. If India leaves SAF, then SAF I don't think so is existence is there. So how do you see that? How do you see ISL in Asia?
Yeah, in terms of where it fits within the Asian leagues, obviously the AFC have got their kind of rankings of how they kind of consider Asian leagues, and only kind of at the times where you've seen them in the Champions League, and also saw an improvement from Mumbai City last year in terms of how that quality is kind of thing. So it's a developing nation, I suppose. Where they fit alongside others, it's very difficult. I think they've got better overseas players than some nations, but I do think there is the consistency and the structure, because it's an infant league in terms of how long it's been established for. It's on the outside looking in as such. But then you've got a strength and depth that some, like the Tajik League, for example, hasn't got, but Istiklal would be potentially higher kind of ranking in that sort of thing. So I suppose it's a difficult question, and I'm usually trying to skirt around most of these things in terms of that. In terms of movement to a regional football federation, I don't see there's an appetite. I don't think there's a need to do it. The CAFA has got a little bit more recognition because they've got a CAFA championship this summer that looks quite an established thing, but they haven't had that for 10 to 15 years. So I wouldn't think it's kind of expectation, or there will be an improvement on that. I think it's using the SAF championships when they do come along in terms of bedding in ground, maybe testing the younger players, making that kind of movement forward, and putting more focus on the World Cup qualification and Asian Cup qualification as it goes forward. But I wouldn't get necessarily hung up on trying to move football federations. I think all of the regional ones are probably kind of in second or third place on kind of priorities for member associations.
The one thing I want to ask you about is the already we know that Cristiano Ronaldo in Saudi and Karim Benzema is also coming up. So there is a Mumbai City this season is going to play in the AFC Champions League, and also other part of the competition. How is the impact of that? Because if it's sure that one of them, Karim Benzema, Cristiano Ronaldo, might play against Mumbai City, and if they come to India, and the fan base of Cristiano and Karim Benzema is huge. So how do you see that the development of football in the Asia, particularly countries like India?
I think it'd be massive, to be honest, and I think the AFC, as we will kind of potentially speak about in a second, in terms of their changes in the AFC club competition. So 3 years ago, they expanded it to 40 teams for the Asian Champions League. The priority for that was reaching out to developing markets that had potential to actually make this a new thing. And the two areas, one from the west being India and one from the east being Malaysia, we haven't seen that kind of boom because of COVID and that massive kind of thing that's just kind of dropped in us over the last couple of years. So we haven't seen those home and away legs to see those fervent kind of fan bases. We haven't seen the appetite from it, and we haven't seen a proper Asian Champions League for the last couple of years. I think this year being the last in this kind of iteration, I think the AFC will probably be left with, we should have probably kept going at what we're doing, because I think you'll see in India or wherever Ronaldo or Benzema goes to play, there'll be increased appetite for seeing these players come. And then you'll see that when the money starts to flow into kind of TV rights deals, etc., and that side of things. So I think it's the perfect way that they've got it at the moment, but it's on its way out. But I do think star players like this will start to have an impact. it needs follow through. So it doesn't need to be the next few years. It needs to be the next 10, 15 years. And then we need to, as you've mentioned before, on getting the young players from overseas players coming here at the very best. But I think it's a way in, especially at those establishing markets, which is the football appetite is so increasing, and there's money behind it in terms of TV rights, that we can start to see that developing.
But what's your thought about this AFC's new competition of three-tier system, where they reduced in the Champions League to 24 clubs? So the developing nation like India, Malaysia, who didn't get any spot in that Champions League. So how do you see that new competition? And also there is I think in knockout stages there is a neutral place for the knockout stages. So how do you see that?
Yeah, so the kind of the view over the last couple of years is that the Champions League has lost its kind of magic for many stages. I say most of the reason behind that has been COVID. In terms of playing in neutral stadiums with no attendances, it's been quite difficult to kind of get that kind of atmosphere that we potentially want from it. So they have decided to kind of go to this 24 team, which kind of slices off the top in terms of the elite competition, which you lose that nuance of kind of having Indian teams in, having Malaysian teams in, having Istiklal been able to run to the quarterfinals and beat Al Hilal along the way, which is a shame. That's the negative. It's a closed shop in terms of that top tier, but the positive is that they're trying to have that mix from the quarterfinal onwards, in terms of you'll be able to have Al Nassr against Sarawak, you'll be able to have Al Hilal against Pohang Steelers, for example. You could have those kind of clashes ahead of time, and you can start to bring Asia together, because at the moment Asia's very, very kind of split on a lot of things.
Split.
Yeah. The difficulty in that is that they're not doing the home and away legs at that stage. It will be on a neutral venue, centralized in one place. That's where we're going to lose the magic again, and we're going to go back to COVID times in terms of having no fans in the stands. There's only going to be a handful of nations that are able to host those side of things. So I think that's going to be quite a difficult one. I think the excitement is going to be this mid-tier tournament, whatever it's going to be called, really. And it's going to feel a little bit like the current Asian Champions League, but very kind of watered down. So you're only going to have one or two teams from each country rather than four. And that's where kind of India has their kind of impact in that. I think it would be ironic if that competition gets more appetite than the Elite League, which will kind of play on its own, like a European Super League that nobody really wants. So it's interesting how it'll play out. And I think one of the key kind of recommendations for it in terms of removing the foreign payer quota might have an impact on that. And we'll see teams kind of exhausting those possibilities. Not these necessarily big spending teams, but smaller teams who've got a little bit of budget that'll be able to go, well, we're able to appeal to European and South American players. And we'll see kind of how that really works. It'll be sad to see some teams having no Asian players kind of in their roster at all, but it is a potential consequence of the AFC's making, unfortunately.
But because the atmosphere we witnessed in this year's Champions League final in Urwa Red Diamonds in Japan and in Al Hilal in Saudi Arabia is I think is similar level to, you can say, the European Champions League final. What atmosphere it has been. So I think the neutralize the venue, I think the decision is I think is going to be backfire, because if we see that Mohan Bagan playing against Al Hilal in India, or you can say that type of, you can say, matches are going to be the hyped up matches. But if we going to play that matches in the neutralized value, then the hype is going to be, obviously, is going to be let down. So I think that would be the main downfall of this new structure.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And in one way, I sympathise with the AFC, because all I've been pushing for the last 10 years is more mix in terms of having West teams playing against East teams. And now they've produced it. It's not great because you're going to have it in a neutral venue. And I think it goes around to the same point. Asia's just too big to be a confederation. And I think that's where I can see the prediction and the cracks already forming between West Asia and East Asia, especially around Asian Cup hosting and how Qatar won that over Korea, for example. And the kind of the appetite between kind of the Eastern clubs, or the kind of more the global North countries such as Australia, Japan, and Korea and their thoughts and practices over Saudi Arabia and Qatar, I can see a political kind of break off as much. It would make more sense to have a kind of West Asian Confederation and an East Asian Confederation than what we've got at the moment, which is we're doing what we can with it. And I think there's a lot of positives for it. But I think there's a lot of disharmony around the World Cup qualification cycle that is dragged out. There's too many small teams playing big teams on a regular basis. And the Champions League just isn't kind of, it's not getting the appetite that people want. I think you've got the Arabian Champions League, which is kind of a very kind of, in theory, a small kind of informal competition that gets staggering amounts of people watching it and engaging with it. So I think if you start to regionalize it, I think you can actually improve games locally. I think we're in this kind of appetite to want Asian football to grow, but it might need to grow in a separate kind of dimension.
I think as you rightly said, that the regionalized wise I think is going to make more impact also, is because the people, if we talk about SAF, that India versus Pakistan is a much bigger game than you can say if we play against UAE. In terms of quality, definitely India versus UAE is bigger, but you can say people's emotion is more, you can say, connect in India versus Pakistan football game, or you can say India versus Bangladesh. And similar, if we Saudi Arabia versus Qatar is a much bigger game compared to, you can say, Saudi Arabia versus South Korea, because people have that community wise relation is there. So definitely I think one of that reason is that. The other thing I want to know from you is that all over the AFCs, this new plan is going to be existence. So how do you see the second and third tier competition? Because AFC Champions League is going to be the quality competition without a doubt, because there is a top 24 clubs around the AFC. But how do you see the second and third tier competition?
As I say, the mid-tier, it excites a lot more people than probably the top tier does, in terms of you've got one or two from each kind of country, rather than this kind of bloated 3 or 4, and then it's kind of contested by one kind of nation and such. You've still got that East-West split, but you've got home and away legs all the way to the final again, so it feels a bit more kind of neutral. And you've seen the kind of appetite in Europe in terms of how the Europa League and the Conference League, which obviously is probably something that's kind of spurred this on. The lower tier formation is very much kind of going back in time in terms of how the President's Cup, I believe kind of ran, in terms of how centralized venues, very short, sharp kind of tournaments, very much like the Challenge Cup, where even that was for national teams. So I think that all kind of, they'll all kind of help towards it, but I don't know how the structure will work. And I think AFC have done some good and some bad in terms of how they promote this and how they get kind of appetite on board. Are they aiming for the whole of Asia to come together along these 3 tournaments, or are they going to have separate identities, which at the moment the AFC Champions League and the AFC Cup are completely different beasts. They're different in terms of how they're marketed and everything along those lines. So it'll be interesting what they've got. And the concern is we're a year out. We don't even know the names of the tournaments. There's lots of names kind of flying around. There isn't that kind of consistency to kind of get you kind of stick in the sand and kind of saying this is what we stand for. And as we've kind of, it's going back right to our first part of the discussion in terms of AFC to move forward needs consistency. They need to jump at something and stick with it. And I think that's where people have been turned off over the last few years, in terms of this is changing every year. I don't even know where we're up to. The farce of having kind of the 2022 Asian Champions League take 18 months to kind of conclude has been kind of farcical on most stage. So I think a lot of this is going to start to go back to normality in terms of having midweek Champions League games around league form, rather than kind of situating in neutral venues. But it'll be interesting how they kind of market each of those 3, and whether yourself in India will be able to have access to the third tier as well as the first tier, even though you're not competing in them. And I think that'll be interesting.
And the last part of this our podcast, I want to, or all the Indian fans also want to know your thoughts about the AFC Asian Cup and India's group. Do you agree that India's group is the group of death in AFC Asian Cup?
I wouldn't say it was a group of death, only because there's probably less expectation of India. So probably I can understand from an India's perspective of thinking it's a group of death. But I think India, obviously, everyone knows, or from your viewers know kind of where we're at with that. I think there's question marks about how this is going to be the defining point of Stimacha's career, India managerial career. But he's got a difficult group to get through to, and I think he's paid for falling down the rankings and falling into that pot four. So you were always going to have 3 teams ahead of you that are going to be stronger than you or in better form. I don't think Syria are the better team, as good as the team as they were 4 years ago, and that's quite understandable given the situation in Syria at the moment. They had a very strong core when they tried to qualify for 2018 World Cup. A couple of those players fall off the boil in terms of form, and then you're starting to struggle around it. I am interested by how their new coaching appointment in terms of Hector Cooper. Not the most exciting of coach, but he's very defensive stability. He's did that with Uzbekistan quite well, but the problem is in attack as such. Which Syria have got abundance of talent. When you've got 3 of the best kind of at that level, probably the 3 best kind of attackers in terms of Omar Al-Sama, Omar Kribin, Al-Moas. So there's 3 key players there that are going to hurt anybody. So if Cooper gets sorted defensively and they're able to unleash those 3 attackers, then yeah, the potential is to change it around. But I know they haven't necessarily been in the form they were. Australia, I think anybody that India would have picked from Group 1 would have been difficult. Australia, the positives being that they've got consistency. They're one of the only team that's got a coach that's been with them for the last 4 years. I think it's them and Japan, and I think that will make it a massive difference. And I think both of those 2 teams are going to be my favourites just because of that. I think a number of the others like Korea and Iran and Qatar are going to be in massive transition. There's going to be potential for an upset there, whereas Australia are going to be a bit more solid. Graham Arnold knows what they need to do. He's done the transition about a year ago, so I think they're going to obviously kind of see this group as quite an easy kind of stroll to kind of get through, and they're going to have lofty ambitions to get quite far. Uzbekistan, very similar in terms of they've had their transition through qualification. The first part of the qualification didn't go so well. They brought in Sherko Katanac, who's done a hell of a lot better. Stabilised this team. Again, very good defensively. The only question mark and the potential hole that kind of India can exploit is that there isn't that many goals in this Uzbek team. They've got a lot of good young players coming through, but this is probably going to be too early for them. If you can quieten off, and this is a big if, Shamuradov and Mashurapov, if you could get them on a bad day, and both of those 2 players haven't had the best last 6 months in terms of club football, then yeah, maybe you've got a chance. But I think what India will be looking forward to, obviously, you can qualify from the group in 3rd place. The fact that there's how it's drawn, you've got Australia or Uzbekistan as your 2 first games. They're going to be quite difficult games. So
that's the biggest problem, because first game is against Australia. If we lose Australia and Uzbekistan, then there is you can say the morale will be down of players against Syria. And I think the 3 days games are also going to be affected, because the intensity last time we lost at the similar type, because we played continuous game and our players physical level is not that great. But this time the players level has been up. So how do you rate Indian side particularly, and which is your favorite player to watch out for?
I think that is the key point. You've hit the nail on the head in terms of it's the morale and keeping that morale through that tournament. And I think that's where it will have to play to Igor Stimach's favour in terms of understanding and trying to project that onto his players and to the public, and saying Australia and Uzbekistan are a significant level ahead of us, but we can still progress through the group. If you could get a draw within one of those 2 games, or even if you only have narrow defeats, there is a potential of sneaking through. And we've in the under-20 World Cup that's going on at the moment, teams got through on 3 points. So there is a potential to do that. In terms of my favourite players, I think I probably mentioned him earlier on in the thing. Anirudh Thapa has always been kind of one of my favourite players to watch. I think I'm really disappointed that he probably hasn't moved out, or we haven't seen him enough at potential Champions League level or anything like that. I think he's an immensely cultured player who's grown into his role in terms of he was very small, slight, young, kind of naive young player when he came through, but now he's looking and experienced. He understands the game. He has that creative kind of ability, and I think he's always been somebody that I looked at wherever he's kind of been playing in India, obviously at a bit of a lower level rather than contesting for the title. But I've always been looking to see highlight footage because I think he's always been somebody that's quite exciting.
He might play this season's Champions League because Mumbai City is targeting Anirudh Thapa, so he might be seen in the
That'd be great.
Champions League. That's the greatness. The final thoughts on the AFC Asian Cup, because biggest tournament of the AFC Confederation is AFC Asian Cup. So how do you see this? Because Qatar World Cup is success, and Qatar is also hosting the AFC Asian Cup. So what's your expectation from this year's AFC Asian Cup?
I think we'll see kind of the impacts of its scheduling in terms of World Cup qualification will have already started before that. So a number of teams will have already, a couple of teams maybe even be out of qualifying for the next Asian Cup before even this Asian Cup's actually happened. So it's in that farcical situation where a lot of teams are midway through their transition. Out of those big teams, there's very few of them that would probably say that Asian Cup's their priority. So again, we're starting a tournament where not everybody's in it on full kind of momentum. I think the fact that it's taking place mid-season for a European audience will mean that there'll be a number of players either coming late. We saw Sung Hyun Min last Asian Cup only miss out on the group stage and come in for the knockout stages. So it all kind of feeds into that. So it can be a bit hit and miss, really. So I think, as I mentioned before, I think Australia and Japan are probably my favourites just because they've got consistency in place. I think Qatar are way out of there. I can't see how Kairos is able to kind of change it around that quickly, unless it had this kind of embarrassment of kind of like you're able to kind of drive through this kind of nationalistic kind of pride again that they had 4 years ago. But I think because they've been there, they've failed at the World Cup, I think that's going to be too difficult. So I think I'm looking out for kind of those teams that are going to have full passion and understanding of this is the biggest thing in their kind of country's history in terms of Uzbekistan, as we've mentioned. They're coming through. They've got a bit more structure in place. The quality is starting to come through. I think this is the perfect opportunity for them before they look towards qualifying for a first ever World Cup. And similarly, Iraq, and I think Iraq obviously won the Asian Cup not too long ago, but they've always had that kind of destabilizing kind of moment within their team. And I think with Jesus Casas seems to have been able to kind of have a system in place. He's been able to gel two sides of the camp in terms of those that are playing in the Iraqi league and those players that are playing in Europe. That's always been a difficult task for any coach to do. He seems to be getting a kind of positivity from that. And I think it all feels kind of like bubbling away that there's a good feeling around Iraqi football. And I think when there's a good feeling in Iraqi football, they can take it up to another level. They can kind of play ahead of what their capability is. So those two teams I'm looking out for as kind of potential bolters, but Australia or Japan potentially for the final.
At last, we are going to take some few questions from the fans. The one question is, why is China still struggling even with so much funding and support from the business groups? Is a question from Sivam Bansal. I think we already discussed in the starting why China model is failed and not the expectation has been reached. Another question is about the India under-17 team, because recently India under-17 has been played in Spain and Germany, where they play against Real Madrid and Atletico Madrid side also, and they perform quite well. So what's did you can say follow the Indian under-17 team, or what's your expectation from the youth side of the Indian football team?
I didn't catch much of the games for that tournament, but I do kind of the same kind of goes before it. There's clearly talent in Indian football. There is clearly enough structure in there. I don't buy this idea that quality players aren't able to succeed in kind of developing nations. It's that next step that they need to do. Once they break through to club football, it's minutes, which I think the ISL is changing. It seems to be it's the structures in place. But it's that next stage, kind of how do we get the exposure on a kind of a national level or international level and kind of move it from that point of view. In terms of China, it's the money's just been taken away from them, so it's a different government kind of priorities. And then we had the big COVID episode in terms of a couple of years without football when everybody else was playing it. So I think they could be not necessarily a dark horse, but I think they have a good team. They've got a team that a lot of players that were good in when they were 23, 3-4 years ago. If those players are able to kind of realize that potential, I think they won't be as bad as everyone expects them to be in the Asian Cup. There was parts of the game against New Zealand when they played them in March that kind of made me kind of sit up and go, actually, they're not in as bad a situation as we probably think. They're just not at that kind of hitting that level of kind of potential Asian Cup winners that maybe they hoped they would be 10 years ago.
Shivam Bansal is asking that Middle East to become a new hub of football, like football shifted from South American clubs to Europe in the 60s. Do you agree with that? That in 60s South American clubs has more dominance, then from shifted to Europe, and now it's time for Asian clubs
to kind of take over that mantle as a second kind of alongside Europe. Is that what you mean?
And the last comment, Harshit Show, they saying, ask Martin, if India allow POI players to play for India, then can India compete with the likes of Iran, Japan, South Korea, etc., and qualify for the World Cup? Do you agree that if India allow OCI players for the players who are playing in the English Championship or in Europe?
I think there's every kind of reason why India could compete to be in the World Cup. There's eight spots now for the World Cup, so I think it's got that potential for a kind of dark horse. And the way that it's formatted, I think you only need a couple of good games and you're through to the next round. And the rounds are a lot more condensed than we've had before. The way that I've kind of seen it is to look to those kind of players that are playing in Europe at the moment that maybe have Indian heritage and maybe kind of trying to think, is this the way that we want to be going from that point of view? But I think there is a positivity there for Indian football to actually start competing at the finer end of things.
Akshay is asking, when will the AFC Women's Clubs Championship take place this year, if it happen at all? Will India Women's League champion get an invitation?
Yeah, I've heard nothing at all, and I've asked a couple of times on this for context that I've had in the AFC. So there's no kind of it's radio silence on that, which is a disappointment. And obviously, it's in its current guise at the moment. India's obviously one of the bigger kind of players within it, and it hasn't kind of got off the ground as much as we hoped. We'll see what's going to happen, but I haven't had any kind of update on that. It doesn't look like it's anywhere kind of near being remedied, which is a bit of a disappointment.
So that's it, guys. We have almost covered all the, you can say, Asian football related point and also related to Indian food point. And the left out point will be discussed in the next podcast whenever we have Martin Lowe, sir. So thank you very much, sir, for your time and give a very good, you can say, insight on the Asian football and how it's changing and what's the impact it is going to be make in the world football and what's the India's role also in the Asian football. And thank you very much, guys, for the joining, and keep supporting football in Asia and keep watching. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye bye.